that brings us to today's lecture by Dr. Dikran Kaligian, who is the author of the Armenian Organization and Ideology under Ottoman Rule 1908-1914. Dikran received his PhD from Boston College and he has been a chairperson of the Armenian National Committee of America, Eastern Region, and are you still the managing editor of the Armenian Review? He has published a number of articles, made a large number of presentations, and contributed articles to edited volumes. And I'm happy to say that I just told me that his book, of which you see copies there, is going into paperback edition, which means that Transaction sold enough copies in hardback. How many did they do? Do you know? I know mine went into 2 hard copy editions and then printings, and then went into paperback. So yours, I'm sure, would sell more, because this is a very hot topic. Indeed, it is a very, very important topic, because this is the period that precedes the First World War and the fatal events that ended the collective existence of Armenians in Eastern Anatolia, in historic Western Armenia. And this is a very important topic because it touches on the question of possibilities and options that may have existed. When we deal with Armenian history and Ottoman history, there's usually a sense of inevitability as to what happened. But this is the period where one could see that there were some options open. And it is also one where you have leaderships, Armenian and Turkish and other, working together to see if something could be done together with regard to the 2 affairs in the Ottoman Empire. And that's the reason why it becomes extremely important to understand and explore, and it is a most welcome addition to our literature and knowledge, this book and Dikran's work. Dikran, all yours.
Thank you, Girard. The bulk of my book basically discusses the relations between 2 political parties, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, the Tashnak Suchun, which I'll abbreviate as ARF as we speak, and the Committee of Union and Progress, the İttihat ve Terakki in Turkish, the Young Turk Party, the leader of the 1908 constitutional revolution in Turkey and the ruling party that would rule not just in the prior period, but also during the years of World War I, would rule the Ottoman Empire. And although intentionally when writing this, I decided not to cover the Armenian genocide period, which of course has been covered in great detail and great contention. There's no way to escape it, because everyone who does write about it always refers back to this earlier period, the period immediately before World War I, and often without actually looking at the period or having done any research in the period. And so if we look at the historiography and anyone who does talk about this 1908-1914 period, if, for instance, we look at those authors who agree with the point of view, say, of the Turkish Historical Society, whether it's Esat Uras or Justin McCarthy or Gunter Louis, according to them, the ARF and the Hunchag, the other Armenian Revolutionary Party, only made a show of solidarity with the CUP, and after a few weeks of euphoria after the 1908 revolution, resumed what is called their disruptive activities. Their main aim was to arm their supporters and prepare fortifications. That's actually a direct quote. The ARF is seen as having infiltrated all Armenian organizations, churches, and churches, as well as having both their regular troops and guerrilla forces at their disposal and ready for rebellion. According to this view, with the outbreak of the First Balkan War in 1912, the ARF took advantage of the situation, broke off relations with the CUP, and started again to demand that Europe, and especially Russia, intervene and force the Ottoman government to institute reforms which would benefit the Armenians. The one and only aim of the ARF was to incite a full-scale rebellion against Ottoman rule, the opportunity for which arrived with Ottoman entry into World War I. Thus, the only reason any Armenians got killed in World War I was because the ARF was preparing this rebellion. It all fits in a nice little package with a bow on top. Therefore, given this position, the position of the ARF regarding European intervention in the empire is a significant issue with the conflicting interpretations in the historiography of the period. My book traces ARF policies and initiatives to answer the important question whether or not the party, and in fact the Armenian community, largely remained loyal to the constitutional regime and only resumed their appeals to Europe after the government's repeated failure to implement their promised reforms. This is a critical issue because as far as the nationalists in the CUP and the Ottoman government were concerned, any European intervention was a major blow to their pride and to their honor. So my book examines the circulars, correspondence, and minutes of the ARF, particularly its branches in Constantinople and Erzurum, which determined policy towards the Ottoman government and the Turkish parties, and even letters between some of the key leadership figures within the party. There's correspondence coming from their field workers and reports on events that I'll mention later, like the Adana massacres and attacks and pillaging of Armenian villages. I add to this, of course, consular reports and other items, but the bulk of the information I've been able to uncover, which hasn't at all really been touched before, is from the ARF archives. So let's look at the other side of the historiography here. The leading historian of modern Armenia, Richard Hovhannisyan, presents the case that the ARF remained loyal to the constitutional regime through the many crises from 1908 to 1912, and even urged Armenians to join the army and defend the Ottoman Empire during the First Balkan War. But after the January 1913 coup, when the nationalist, chauvinist element of the CUP took over, any chance of cooperation with the ARF was ended. And so I hope to resolve, and I hope I have resolved, these many conflicting conclusions in the current historiography, because there's been no in-depth examination of the internal documents of the ARF in the Ottoman Empire for the years following the Constitutional Revolution. It's impossible to obtain a true picture of Armeno-Turkish relations in this period without an accurate analysis of the activities and the relations of the two leading parties. But we have to remember the loss or destruction of the papers of the CUP will always limit on how much we will discover from that side. However, by examining the observations and views of ARF leadership, field workers, and their parliamentary deputies, we can shed light on some very dimly viewed areas. And so while we may not have a record of the deliberations of the CUP at that time, we do have a description of its actions and analysis of its motives by individuals who had worked closely with many of its leading lights. So, given that as an outline, let me cover what happens between 1908 and 1914. Both the ARF and the Reformed Hunchak Party had started a dialogue with Turkish opposition groups in Paris starting in 1900. And the Turkish opposition groups, a large part of that was the CUP itself. They actually joined together with Turkish, Arab, Greek, Kurdish, and other representatives and actually came to an agreement that they were going to try to overthrow Sultan Abdülhamid together. Now, in the end, the 1908 constitutional revolution was not done by these groups together, but by the CUP working with a rebellion of the Turkish army in Macedonia. But all these opposition groups greeted this revolution with huge enthusiasm and jubilation, along with much of the population of the empire. In fact, one ARF leader, Mikhail Varantian, writes, "All of Constantinople rippled in unusual enthusiasm." The CUP and the ARF became key players in Ottoman constitutional politics. For the ARF to influence government policies to improve conditions for the Armenians, it would have to work closely with the CUP. Communications between the two parties, though, were immediately hampered by the fact that neither was headquartered in Constantinople. The ARF Western Bureau was in Geneva, and the CUP headquarters was in Salonika. The ARF actually ended up establishing a subgroup of their Western Bureau in Constantinople to solve that, but they would always have to travel to Salonika because the CUP Central Committee would always still be there, and that always is going to slow things down. However, in 1908, elections were held throughout the Ottoman Empire, and a multi-ethnic parliament was seated. Although a majority of its 280 some odd members you could classify as ethnically Turkish, it also included 53 Arabs, 27 Albanians, 22 Greeks, Slavs, Kurds, Jews, and 11 Armenians, including 4 ARF members who represented the eastern provinces. In this atmosphere, however, of increasing liberties, an armed counter-revolution broke out in April 1909 in Constantinople and succeeded in driving the CUP out of the city. The opponents of the CUP, as well as reactionaries and supporters of Sultan Abdul Hamid, were the ones who supported this coup. However, within 2 weeks, an army under Mahmud Şevket Pasha had suppressed the revolt, come to Constantinople, put down the revolt, but taking advantage of the political unrest, anti-Armenian massacres broke out far from Constantinople in the city of Adana in Cilicia and the towns and villages of Adana province. The governor and commandant of gendarmes there took no action to protect the population, and you had 3 days of massacres. Then the army that had to put down the revolution in Constantinople came to Adana, and rather than restoring order, in fact, a new round of massacres broke out and a burning of thousands of Armenian houses in the city. In all, some 25,000 Armenians would perish in these 2 rounds of massacres. So here you have almost immediately the first tests of ARF-CUP relations. The ARF had to decide, in the face of Armenian public opinion, whether to continue its cooperation with the CUP. This was dependent on the one hand on an evaluation of how culpable the CUP was for the massacres, and on the other hand, the ARF had to weigh the substantial potential benefits to the Armenian community and all Armenian citizens if the CUP instituted and carried through on a true constitutional regime. So the ARF is in this serious dilemma, and they were torn between their solidarity with the progressive elements within the CUP and its revulsion at the murderous acts of their chauvinist elements. The Western Bureau wanted to help the progressive elements consolidate their power within the party and within the empire. Yet, should these progressives lose the upper hand, or if in fact it turns out they, were their professions of faith and constitutionalism and equality for all peoples were just empty gestures, the consequences for the Armenians would be deadly. They had, in fact, because with the Constitution, the ARF had taken 2 steps. One, they declared the support for the territorial integrity of the Ottoman Empire, meaning they did not want to have Armenian land separated from it. And secondly, because you can't really be a member of parliament and have your own army, they disbanded their self-defense units, the Fedai units, so that if there had to be self-defense, now these units had actually been dissolved, so the population was particularly vulnerable. After weighing all these considerations, the Western Bureau decided to make another attempt at continuing cooperation with the CUP. It would be conditional on the government taking a number of actions on critical items, and so they set down their demands to the CUP, who was making every effort to get the ARF not to break off relations. I mean, they did everything to say, that they were sincere in their support of reforms, and the things had just gotten out of their hand. And so the ARF said there had to be legal punishment for the officials who took no action during the massacres, that there had to be trials for those who'd actually taken part in the killing, there had to be compensation for the Armenians, there had to be an annuity for the widows of the dead, and perhaps most importantly, the gendarmerie had to be reorganized so that it would be composed of all nationalities, not just Muslims. If you want someone to protect the Armenians, you need some Armenians in the gendarmerie. So on this basis, they did not end cooperation, despite the fact that they were taking a pretty big political risk here, especially within the Armenian community, where you had some Armenians who never trusted the CUP and said, why are you cooperating with them? And those who perhaps initially trusted them said, well, now you see what they're really like. They're massacring us all over again. And so the ARF was really putting their reputation and the support they'd gotten over the years in self-defense actions for the Armenian people prior to the constitutional revolution on the line here. But of course, the agreement to continue cooperation was going to be conditional. They weren't going to give 100 chances to the CUP. There was going to be limited goodwill from here. For all the enthusiasm that was there in 1908, clearly there could only be so much delay in reform, or so many, very many more chances before the ARF would have to cut off relations, and they make that clear to the CUP. So what is the ARF looking for? We talk about reform. Well, basically there's two major issues. Of course there's a lengthy list, but two major ones. One is security. Armenian population has been attacked for years, particularly by Kurdish tribes, by Turkish Aghas. Can we protect the Armenian population? And in fact, initially, for the first year and a half, if you put aside Adana, there was a great increase in security for the Armenian population, and not by huge amount of action, just by the fact that the Constitution had declared that all Ottoman citizens are equal, unlike under the Sultan, where non-Muslims were gavurs, were infidels, and therefore had fewer rights, and there was actually a sense of impunity. Now suddenly they were all equal. And the Kurdish, a Kurdish tribal chief, now was not sure if he were to attack an Armenian village, if he were to kill, if he were to steal lands, whatever else, as he had done with impunity before, if he might not be punished for it. And in fact, in the first year under the constitutional regime, there were a number of trials, not a lot, but some, where those who had killed Armenians, who had attacked Armenians, who had stolen lands, and other minorities, were in fact put on trial, and some were hanged. And so for the first year and a half, there was a great increase in security, mostly just by having this constitution in place. Once that year and a half goes by, as the CUP starts feeling themselves less, let's say, politically powerful, they start pulling back. They don't have many more trials. They stop making the strong professions that everyone's equal, and then the attacks are going to start up again. Things are going to get progressively worse, and this is going to be one of the things that's going to hurt relations between the two parties. So security was one, but the one that was even bigger was land. And the way to understand this, and I have to give a little bit of background to do this, is for all the talk that we sometimes hear about, the Armenians being the big merchants, being the bankers, the money lenders, the Armenians, the Greeks, and the Jews who had all the money in the Ottoman Empire, and that's true. They were disproportionately representative in the merchant class because it was one of the few fields that were open to them under Ottoman law. The vast majority, 95% of the Armenian population, were peasants and were dependent on the land to make a living. So the issue of ownership of land was critical for them. And yet, for the decades under Sultan Abdul Hamid, starting before the 1890 massacres, but continuing through it, you had dispossession of Armenian peasants throughout the Armenian provinces, where any Kurdish chief or a large Turkish landowner could dispossess, either by force or by trickery or by using their local power, whatever else, would dispossess Armenian peasants. And not only was this a problem, problem with the loss of land, but now when a peasant no longer has the ability to live in their homeland and in where they've grown up, where they've lived for generations, now they have to leave. So you had an actual migration, a westward migration, from the villages to the towns, from the towns to the cities, often from there to the major cities of Constantinople and Izmir, or to Europe and the United States and the rest of the world, because they could not they could not make a living on the land. So this was of critical importance to the ARF, the issue of restoring lands to those who had been dispossessed, because they knew in the long run, and in fact Sultan Abdul Hamid, in his planning of allowing these dispossessions, knew in his own mind as well that if he could reduce the population, the Armenian population of those historical Armenian provinces, then the Armenians would have less of a case to be demanding reforms from Europe, which is always their complaint. That if perhaps instead of it being a 45 or a 43% of the population in Erzurum province being Armenian, if suddenly it's 35 or it's 25, well, why are the Armenians demanding this for themselves? They're demanding autonomy or whatever else. And so the ARF realized that they had to have land reform. And so that was their number one demand throughout from the CUP. There has to be restitution of lands to those dispossessed. And they could not use the judicial system because this was still slanted. It would take years to reform that. As in fact, I think I quote Professor Sunni on that particular item. So it had to be done administratively. The parties had to get together, have a joint Turkish-Armenian committee, look at the land deeds, look at what happened in the prior couple decades, and restore these lands to these people. And in fact, it starts working. as soon as the word of the constitutional revolution takes place and everyone realizes, well, according to this, we're equal, many of those who had left the country or who had gone to the cities start returning back to the lands, returning back to their villages and demanding their lands back, which immediately is going to cause clashes with the Turks or the Kurds who are currently on it. And so the two parties agree that the only method is to have a joint Turkish-Armenian commission. And they start to work on that, but after the 1909 counter-revolution in Adana, either through a loss of self-confidence or their unwillingness to expend their political capital on something that predominantly benefits Armenians, the CUP starts retreating from the Joint Commission idea. And so in the correspondence, you see all these meetings that the ARF leaders have with the CUP, and particularly with one of their key leaders, who would later be Minister of the Interior, and while he's that, Talat Pasha, a name that would be familiar to us. And Talat is the person they're working closest with, and who is actually part of the liberal faction within the CUP. And he keeps assuring them, yes, we're working on it, we just have political obstacles. And you just, give us time, we're working on it. And he realizes and he says, I know that a political rupture with the ARF is going to be harmful for us. I want to make this work for you. And the ARF itself is not totally unrealistic. They don't expect it all to happen immediately. They know it's going to take some time, but they also know that if they can't fix this particular problem, everything else is going to be useless. And so when, over the course of about 2.5 years, the ARF sees that the CUP will not take the decisive step, Talat keeps making these promises but refuses to actually go forward. This is going to be the key issue when they decide they're not delivering. In 1912, they're going to say they're not delivering on reform. We need to break off relations with the CUP. We can't, it's not delivering for the Armenian people. Because while delays in implementation could be countenanced, an abandonment of this idea of land restitution could not. And despite everything that I read at the beginning about the historiography, this was the real reason that the relations were broken off. There's no way that anyone can read the documents that I've read and come to a different conclusion, because this is the number one item. And in fact, not only do the Armenians know that, even the first secretary of the British Embassy in 1913 writes, this failure to settle the usurped lands question had been interpreted by the Armenians as evidence of bad faith on behalf of the committee, the CUP, and of their secret intention to persist in the old methods of breaking up the peasantry. To me, it's pretty clear, and it was even clear to him, this was the real issue that would cause a problem. Okay, so let's move on from lands. In order to try to get these two parties working together, they form a joint body in Constantinople. And they end up meeting, they end up going over all the problems. In 1911, they're having these heated discussions because the CUP representatives had to admit that their party wasn't very strong in the interior. In many ways, the ARF was stronger, and the ARF actually would offer to help them build up the constitution there. They agreed, the CUP did, to write to the governors of Erzurum and Bitlis provinces concerning the increasing killings in their vilayets, as well as the prosecution of ARF leaders. In March, the Western Bureau has a joint meeting with the Armenians who are parliamentary deputies. And they conclude, again, the government is not showing good faith towards the Armenians. The local government officials are still biased. And the one area where there was some improvement was in removing some of the biased governmental officials. Again, first year and a half, 2 years, they start removing, after a large number of complaints, some of the most egregious anti-Armenian officials in the Armenian provinces get removed. And the case the ARF makes to them is not only these guys anti-Armenian, they're anti-CUP. They're anti-Constitution. I mean, maybe they've joined your party, but they have absolutely they don't really support it. They just wanted to keep their jobs. So it's in your interest as well as ours to remove them. But despite the fact they had some encouraging things initially, the bias, there's still many more biased officials that have not been removed. And so the ARF sends two of its leaders, Varamyan and Sharigian, to Salonika to express its disappointment in the lack of progress on all these items. And they actually have a positive meeting. It looks like things might be going forward, but there's still huge concern. We don't know if this is really going to work. So the ARF Sixth World Congress, the highest meeting of the ARF, convenes in Constantinople in the summer of 1911, And their main agenda item, as you might guess, was the question of cooperation with the CUP. They evaluated the agreement that had just been signed in Salonika, and they agree, well, yeah, that's about the best we can get, but these guys better start delivering. And so based on everything, on an evaluation, and basically it's a 53-page report that was submitted by the Western Bureau to this World Congress saying this is what's happened so far during these first 2.5 years, they come down to saying we're going to give the CUP one more chance, but if after the Bureau's appeal to the CUP that they and their cabinets drawn from it do not show through their deeds the realization of their repeated promises are going to be imminent, the Western Bureau is authorized to cease relations with the CUP. So they're going to get an ultimatum, which is actually going to happen. Now, the thing to keep in mind is the CUP's political position is not strong, and the ARF knows that. Again, you actually see them discussing it. They realize they have their own internal opposition, and new opposition parties are coming up. They're having trouble even containing some of the generals who are their key supporters in the army. They've been getting attacked or losing lands to all the European powers from the first day of them taking power. I mean, as soon as they took power, the Austrians took Bosnia and Herzegovina. In 1911, the Italians are going to invade Libya and take that from them. And coming up in 1912, their former vassals, the Balkan states, are going to start a war with them. So they understand that the CUP is in a difficult position, but that not delivering for the Armenians is just going to make that worse. And that they're trying to convince the CUP of. And so finally, in 1912, the ARF Bureau gives there's two major things that are going to happen in 1912. One, they're having negotiations over the new parliamentary elections that are going to take place. The Armenians are demanding many more than the 11 seats that they had before. The Turks are saying yes, yes, yes, but then not delivering that message to their provincial bodies. And so this is seen as a deception by the CUP. This is causing the Western Bureau to say these guys are lying. Basically, they write to their counterparts in Erzurum saying these guys are just lying to our faces. The Eastern Bureau actually, interestingly, writes back and says, calm down, guys. It's not that bad. I mean, for all for all this talk, often the ARF is seen as this monolith, this one great power that did this or did that. There's these huge fights within the two bodies as to whether this is really the case. And the Western Bureau is saying, I'm sick of dealing with these guys. The Eastern Bureau writes back, and particularly Rostom, one of the founders of the party, writes back and says, guys, calm down. This is politics. Don't overreact. But with all this going on, and because they are being disappointed in all their demands, not just the elections, the Western Bureau gives an ultimatum to the CUP that they're going to have 15 days to resolve. That items such as the creation of Armenian and Kurdish village guards in some of the Armenian provinces, that the government should actually be giving arms to the Armenians and to the settled village Kurds to defend themselves against Kurdish bandits, Kurdish tribes, anyone else who might be attacking them. Ensuring the right of return with a government subsidy for Armenian refugees who'd been forced out of the country, and that there be 200 Armenian gendarmes for each of the Armenian provinces. And the ARF says if the CUP fails to order these administrative charges within 15 days and did not start working on these other issues, the ARF would end their cooperation with the CUP, consistent with the decision of the Sixth World Congress. And this is where the Eastern Bureau comes back and says, no, guys, you're not overdoing it, but that's what they gave. But while they're waiting for this ultimatum for a response to it, the CUP government actually falls. It's kind of interesting, and in fact, you actually read the ARF evaluation of this, saying, here is the CUP, and part of the problem is they didn't really have the broad public support. They came to power through a military coup. They stayed in power by their support of the military. So as soon as another group got formed within the military, they collapsed almost immediately. Nazim Pasha formed a Praetorian Guard called the League of Savior Officers, and within a week, the government fell. And now the ARF and the Armenians are really in a difficult position because they were in a no-win situation. because in spite of all the deceptions of the CUP, all its manipulations, false promises, delays in reforms, they were still the only party the ARF felt they could negotiate with. They saw them actually as a lesser evil when compared to their opponents who had now taken office and who were actually less progressive and less likely to give rights. And so the ARF ceases its press criticism of the CUP in the second week of August, in late July when the government falls. But in the second week of August, the two bureaus, Eastern and Western, announced in their papers Azadamard in Constantinople and Haraç in Erzurum that they've broken off relations with the CUP. Further, they stated they would maintain a position of neutrality during the conflict between the Turkish parties in parliament. This is the end of the official cooperation. But note the date. This is happening, announced in the second week of August, and it's public. It's in the press. The reason I note the date is, remember what I said at the beginning. The ARF did this. It was only with they took advantage of the First Balkan War. Well, it's at the end of September when the Balkan states and the Ottoman Empire start mobilizing their army, and it's on October 8th that the First Balkan War breaks out. So unless the ARF were soothsayers and could predict a war in advance, clearly they had made the decision independent of anything to do with the Balkan War. Well, a war is troublesome in the first place. It raises fears, particularly when the Balkan states end up defeating the Ottoman Empire in the war. This is going to really weaken the CUP and make them angry, as you might guess. And so the war and the parties' break with the CUP increase the danger to the Armenian population. So Rostom and Murad, two of the ARF leaders, went to Constantinople to meet with Simon Zavarian, and their only agenda item is how are we going to start arming the people and reforming the self-defense groups in order to defend ourselves, defend the people if massacres start breaking out again. But they determined that in order to reestablish these groups they dissolved was going to take years, money, resources, and leadership, none of which was currently available. In fact, they spend the next 2 years trying to collect the money to buy the guns in order to arm the population to reform these groups. The problem is when they send Varamyan to the Caucasus to collect funds for self-defense efforts, the bourgeoisie refused to contribute, Varamyan's report said. Only the students and the workers had given him some 3,000 rubles. In Egypt, in fact, when they made the same attempt there, the Armenian community disputed the need for self-defense at all and invoked the name of Bohos Nubar Pasha to buttress their case. Bohos Nubar Pasha, the founder of the AGBU, who is one of the key leadership figure in the Armenian community, actually negotiating with the European powers to try to get reforms for the Armenians. What is the ARF going to do? They actually send Mikhail Varantian to meet with Bohos Nubar and explain what's going on. And Bohos Nubar says, I'm not against self-defense activities. I have no problem with you guys, collecting money and importing arms. Just let's make sure it doesn't become public. As long as we don't get negative attention or we start a rebellion prematurely, I have no problem with you collecting funds. And I, in fact, if my negotiations fail, I will actually support you in this activity. When Varantian informs Bohos Nubar that the bourgeoisie was not contributing, and in fact was using his name as an excuse for not contributing, he said, they're acting like Jesuits, which I guess in those days means a cheapskate. And it's kind of curious, I wrote that in my dissertation, and I actually graduated from Boston College, one of the leading Jesuit schools in the country, so I'm not sure. I guess it was okay. And in fact, he says they're being cheap. They're just using my name as an excuse, and just as an excuse to avoid contributing. And he, in fact, agreed to write letters to Egypt and to Bulgaria to his supporters, saying that he is not opposed to self-defense funding, and he, in fact, supports the ARF in their activities. So that was a very interesting exchange. The same time this is happening, with the end of after the First Balkan War ends, when the government falls, a second Balkan War breaks out. And as that is winding down, the major preoccupation of the ARF and the Armenian community during 1913, besides the self-defense issue, is they're negotiating the end of a war between the Europeans and the Ottomans. And of course, the primary thing is, okay, what are the borders going to be in the Balkans? But they also naturally evolved, as they had in the past. These negotiations also started considering the issue of reforms within the Ottoman Empire. And so while this is going on, the Russian government is doing all in their power to try to take the leading role in saying, okay, what reforms can we have for the Armenians, and I want to be in charge of them. And so what you see, what I write about in my book, is they have months of these negotiations where basically Germany behind the scenes is helping Turkey not have to agree or stall as long as possible. In fact, they managed to stall these reforms for over a year before they finally agreed to it. But by early 1914, they finally, Russia and Germany, come to an agreement that, yes, okay, here's what the final agreement will be. We'll actually take the Armenian provinces, split them in two, and give each one a European inspector general who will oversee the Ottoman officials, so that you actually have a neutral arbiter. And the ARF took an active role in the selection of where these inspectors are going to come from, met with them in Paris and in Constantinople to brief them, and in fact were putting people as part of their inspection teams to be able to help point out what the particular problems were. And this is, as Girard mentioned at the beginning, this was the opportunity. There was one opportunity with the Constitution, if that had worked. The second opportunity came with if you actually succeeded in having European inspectors overseeing the Armenian provinces, then you might have had a chance for security and return of lands, whatever else. Unfortunately, they've managed to stall things enough that by the summer of 1914, one of the inspectors has got to his post. The other one is still in Constantinople when war is about to break out in Europe and they have to leave. What could have happened had those inspectors had there not been a war, had the Ottoman Empire not entered the war, had these inspectors been able to actually do their work? Who knows? There might have been a chance for actual cooperation and actual living conditions for the Armenians within the Ottoman Empire. Let me cover the one last thing, being the run-up to the First World War, where a number of things kind of coincide. The ARF has its 8th World Congress, the first one it holds actually in Armenia, in Erzurum, or on Armenian land, historical Armenia, let's put it that way, in Erzurum in July of 1914. It was adjourned early because the war was breaking out in Europe, but they left a committee behind to take care of whatever was undone. While they're meeting, 2 representatives of the CUP and the government show up, Dr. Behadin Shakir and Naji Bey. Behadin Shakir will become notorious during the Armenian genocide. They met for 3 days with Rostom, Agnuni, and Varamyan. And they have lengthy negotiations. And after many of these discussions, the CUP representatives disclosed that their government had decided to take advantage of what they expected to be German defeat of France and Russia to take care of all their unfinished business, get their lands back from the Serbs, get their islands back from the Greeks, get rid of the capitulations, all the things that have been bothered them. And further, they said, should the Russians be completely defeated, they would advance into the Caucasus, either to conquer it or to incite a revolution there. And according to them, the Georgians and the Azeris, the Tatars, were already ready to join in a rebellion against Russian rule to help the Turks there. But the Armenians were key to their success because the CUP believed the ARF had the power and the ability to persuade Russian Armenians to remain loyal to the Russian government until the critical point when they get the message from Turkey and they start the rebellion and become a 5th column against the Russian army. And they assured them that the Ottoman government had no interest in occupying the Caucasus, but merely wanted to pull it out of the Russian orbit and give it autonomy. Now, there's 2 ironic things here. Number 1, the promise. Number 2, what is the proposal here? The proposal is that the Armenians be a 5th column against the Russian army. Well, what is the Turkish historiography about the Armenian genocide? Well, the Armenians were the ARF was being a 5th column against the Ottoman army. So here you are proposing to them exactly what you were accusing the ARF of, and the key figure in both places is the ARF. Let me cover briefly the historiography of here. Because this is such a critical issue, if you read Esat Uras or Justin McCarthy or Gunter Louis, they all say, oh, this meeting never took place. There's no real evidence of it. I've actually been looking for a few additional things since I wrote the book. I've only found 5 books that talk about it. In fact, 3 of them 5 books, 4 of which are or articles, 4 of which are written by ARF members who were not part of the negotiations, but who were in Erzurum and met with the ARF negotiators the same day that they were meeting with the CUP. So, I mean, as close as you can come to firsthand. And then, when I was in the ARF archives, I actually found the report of Varamyan, who had been sitting with the CUP, and at this point is the only first-hand account of this, and it's his report that says this is what Naji and Shakir were saying to us, and contemporaneously he's reporting back to the Western Bureau, this is what they offered us, and this is what we said back. The ARF representative said Russian Armenians no longer had the enthusiasm for Ottoman constitutional rule that we had from 1908 to 1910. The errors by the government and the CUP in regards to the Ottoman Armenians would give Russian Armenians no confidence that supporting the Ottoman government would actually improve conditions. They told them to go back, improve things for Ottoman Armenians, and then come back and talk to us. And in the meantime, don't get into this war. They made it very clear. The Ottoman Empire should stay neutral. That not only would it be bad for the Armenians to enter this war, but it could mean the end of the Ottoman Empire, which of course it did. But the CUP representatives made it very clear, no, they'd already decided Germany's going to win, they're going to be on their side, and so that's the way they left things. And the ARF now is in a very precarious position. They now have to decide what their response is going to be. In Constantinople, they have a consultative meeting called by the Western Bureau. They decide all Ottomans, citizens, Armenians, have to do their duty as citizens, join the Ottoman army. All Russian Armenians have to do their duty as Russian subjects and join the Russian army. The question is, do we go beyond that? Should we also have those who are exempt in Russia from service form volunteer units to support the under Russian army leadership, to support the Russian army, to help protect the Armenians when they go with the Russian army into the Armenian provinces because there could be massacres. And there's a disagreement. In Constantinople, the majority says, no, we should keep our forces, have our Fedai groups, keep them in Russia, let them be in reserve in case massacres break out, but don't put them under Russian leadership. But the Eastern Bureau in Constantinople, in Tiflis, when the Vahan Papazian, the ARF deputy, meets with them, they said, no, there's so much enthusiasm here in the Caucasus. The people are demanding the ARF not only take the leadership in forming these volunteer units. There is no choice. We're going to have these volunteer units. And so they take the decision. Ottoman Armenians, and they made this clear to Naji and Shakir as well, the Ottoman Armenians are going to join the Ottoman army. Russian Armenians are going to join the Russian army, despite the fact they know this could cause fraternal warfare, where Armenians are killing Armenians on both sides of a war fought largely on Armenian lands. This was the difficult decision that they took, they agreed with, and this was the tightrope the ARF had to walk as the guns of war approached. Thank you.